Welcome back to the PLURIBUS Unus Mundus series. This is the second in the series. I've written 4 papers. The first video was about the introductory paper. This one is about the second paper, and it's entitled PLURIBUS Unus Mundus, Physics, Psychology, and the Constitution. So the whole plan of the series of papers is to help to reunite the left and the right by establishing 2 constitutional amendments specifically designed for that purpose. The first is to introduce an amendment that establishes the equation Psyche equals singularity as a definition of the self, so that the entire Constitution should be interpreted through the understanding that each of us individual conscious beings is one with the omnicentric gravitational singularity and its all-encompassing horizon, as described by string theory. I discussed this in the introductory video. The second amendment I'm proposing to add is that we add a 4th branch of government, the function of which is to integrate the other 3 with the understanding that the psyche is the gravitational singularity. Okay, so updating the Constitution to harmonize with the advances of physics. That is the topic of this series of papers. So let me read here a little bit from this paper. Here's something Thomas Jefferson, he wrote a letter while he was in France in the 1780s, while his compatriots were working on the Constitution. He asked to have a portrait sent to him in France, and it was of 3 individuals. So here's the quote: "Bacon, Locke, and Newton, as I consider them as the 3 greatest men that have ever lived, without any exception, and as having laid the foundation of those superstructures which have been raised in the physical and moral sciences." So Francis Bacon, John Locke, and Isaac Newton. These are the the founders of the moral and physical sciences. They established the worldview within which the founders developed our Constitution. So what is that worldview? So John Locke was an empiricist philosopher. Knowledge comes from the 5 sense organs. If you can see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it, it's real. Otherwise, it's imaginary. And Isaac Newton, who was actually a mystic and was an investigator of alchemy, from which Jung and Wolfgang Pauli derived the term Unus Mundus, which is the title of the series of papers. But overtly, Newton developed his physics of 3 dimensions of empty space, rigid dimensions of empty space, up, down, left, right, backward, forward, 1 dimension of linear time, moving forward at a constant rate regardless of the observer's relative positions and speed through space. So it's within that framework that our Constitution was developed. Specifically, the idea of the 3 branches of government balancing each other, like balance beams and the law of action and reaction. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's Isaac Newton. Similarly, for our Constitution, each of the branches of government has an equal and opposite branch of government to balance off and check each other's power. Rather than assume each individual will work for the common good, the founders assumed each individual is a greedy and selfishly motivated person with a propensity to form factions that put their little party's good over the good of the whole. How do you deal with that? As we'll read in the Federalist paper number 10, you can't get rid of the causes of factions, says Madison. So therefore you have to address the effects. And the way to address the effect of the factious spirit, the propensity to unite into little groups who are at odds with the whole, or in our case, the propensity to divide ourselves into 2 enormous groups, each one despises the other and tries to oppress it. To counteract that human propensity, we have these systems of checks and balances. You've got a House and a Senate. Within the legislative branch, you've got the executive branch that can veto laws that the legislature puts forward. You've got the judicial branch to make sure everyone's following the law properly. And that has worked very well since 1787. But we find ourselves currently in a situation where we've divided ourselves into 2 enormous factions, both of which despise the other. And our system of checks and balances does not seem equipped to deal with that. So how would the evolution of physics and psychology since Isaac Newton's physics, which he put forth in the Principia in 1687, how was the evolution of physics and psychology going to help us update our Constitution in a way that can deal with the factions of the Democratic and Republican Party? I am saying that string theory enables us to do that because the cosmology it describes mirrors Carl Jung's psychology, his vision of the cosmos and the psyche's place in it, in a way that resurrects Plato's original academic cosmology. And it was within that cosmology that the idea of natural law was developed by Thomas Aquinas, following St. Augustine, who was following Plato, and that the specific function of this ultimate archetype of the self, which Jung and Pauli called the Unus Mundus, it is to unite opposites. And according to this theory, psyche equals singularity, which is based on Carl Jung's equation, at the end, which he put at the end of a letter dated February 29, 1952. I call it the Leap Day letter. If psychic energy is equal to mass, according to Einstein's equation, psyche equals singularity. According to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. So if psychic energy, if it's real, it should be able to be measured. It should have some mass. How come we can't measure it? Jung said, well, maybe it's because the psychic energy is equivalent to the highest intensity of mass possible in the smallest space. So his equation said psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. The highest intensity of matter would be infinite. The smallest space is zero volume, and that just so happens to be the definition of a gravitational singularity, a point of infinite density. The entire universe is contained in the gravitational singularity. It contains all space and all of time. And I am saying we should identify the self, as Jung did in his equation, the Leap Day equation, with this gravitational singularity and the horizon of the cosmos that encompasses it. This is complicated physics and psychology, but only complicated to a degree. Nobody has to have mastered higher mathematics to understand the philosophical implications of what the mathematical physicists have discovered. I'm saying this is within the realm of every average citizen of the United States, but it's not easy. It doesn't lend itself to a quick and superficial understanding. It will take some study, and that's what I'm trying to do in this series of papers. So, I'm saying as Jefferson looked to Bacon, Locke, and Newton for the foundation of the superstructures of physics and philosophy, I suggest that we update the Constitution to reflect Pauli and Jung's theory of the ultimate foundation of the physical and moral sciences, their theory that it is made of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, all of which center on and are encompassed by the mandala manifesting archetype of the self. So Carl Jung said, when the conscious ego is pulled between opposing demands, this ultimate archetype of the self compensates it with mandala imagery during dreams and fantasies to lure it towards a union of opposites. That happened in the realm of mathematics when real numbers and imaginary numbers, the square roots of negative numbers, were functionally united on the unit circle and then the Riemann sphere. That's a mandala, a circle or a sphere with a central point. And then Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Hooft reunited the opposing theories of general relativity, which is Einstein's theory of gravity, and quantum mechanics. They were incommensurable. They united them. They made them work in their holographic string theory of information conservation in black holes, which are nature's perfect mandalas, a two-dimensional event horizon, a perfect sphere, encompassing a perfect mathematical point of infinite density. So, to me, that was... Jung and Pauli talked about the unit circle on the complex number plane, the mandala that united real and imaginary numbers, and this union of general relativity and quantum mechanics in a black hole just falls right in line with that theory. So the theory that they had about the function of the self archetype, which they call the Unus Mundus, and the God archetype. They had various names, the self. That idea of this uniting function of that mandala symbol has been vindicated in the field of mathematical physics at least twice, with the unit circle and then the union of general relativity and string theory and quantum mechanics, which were incommensurable in a black hole. All right, so I'm going to keep reading here. Here is an article written by, it's actually a book review written by someone that I studied with, Dr. James Dater. He was the founder and chair of the Alternative Futures Program in the Department of Political Science, winner of the 2010 Political Futurist of the Year Award. So he wrote a book review of Ted Becker's anthology entitled Quantum Politics, Applying Quantum Theory to Political Phenomena. It came out in 1991. Dater called it a kind of Bible for future political generations. And so then he says, after the foreword by Becker, the volume opens with a presidential address to the American Political Science Association delivered by William Bennett Monroe in 1927, titled Physics and Politics, an Old Analogy Revised. So the point is, the constitutions of all nations today, beginning with the U.S. Constitution of 1789, derive from a Newtonian worldview dominant in the 18th century. This worldview is rationalistic, mechanistic, posits immediate cause and effect, predictive, and assumes an objective real world which can be objectively observed and measured by a trained neutral observer. So each of those assumptions upon which our Constitution was based has been undermined by advances in science since 1687, when Isaac Newton established his physics in the Principia. So Dr. Dater mentions Darwin and Freud. He says, to just name a few, who suggest how marginal indeed rationality, predictability, and objectivity are in human decision-making, but in the early 20th century, quantum physics seemed to go even farther. So, according to quantum physics, particles are only there as little ball bearings of matter when we observe them. When we're not observing them, they merge into these immaterial waves of probability for where a particle might appear were it to be observed. Are they immaterial? Well, they're not exactly material, because matter, as it's normally understood, at least by Isaac Newton, doesn't dissolve when you stop looking at it. It's there whether you're observing it or not. Well, quantum physics indicates that it's not the case. When a quantum particle is not being directly observed, it exists in this state of potentiality, a wave of probability, which I've discussed in other videos, and we'll get into some of those details a little later here. But what I point out is that Darwin and Freud, they definitely called the idea of human rationality into question, but they were also, both of them, still based on Isaac Newton's mechanistic cosmology of these little bits of matter in three empty dimensions of space. So, and I point that out because we're going to see later President Woodrow Wilson, he wrote about this fact that his theory that the Constitution is modeled on Isaac Newton's physics. He says what we should do is update it to reflect Darwinian science. And I'm saying, well, Darwinian science is just based on Newton's mechanistic physics. What we really need to do is update the Constitution to reflect the union of general relativity and quantum mechanics and string theory, in the recognition that string theory mirrors Jungian psychology. So if Thomas Jefferson said that, Bacon, Locke, and Newton are the three greatest humans who have ever lived, and their influence is found in our Constitution, as we'll also go see, Jefferson also said that the laws have to keep date with the advances in science. So Jefferson's own reasoning would indicate we should again update our Constitution. All right, but continuing here. In 1957, an article by James Robinson, a congressional fellow of the American Political Science Association, wrote, Newtonianism refers to the application of Sir Isaac Newton's mathematical interpretation of the physical world to the non-physical world. It implies an ordered, predictable, mechanical, law-governed political world, resembling the way in which the planets follow ordered, prescribed, and predictable paths. Okay, so I say if the laws of psychology and physics mirror each other, because mind and matter both radiate from the Unus Mundus, as Jung and Pauli theorize, Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founders of quantum theory, worked with Carl Jung for 25 years, then it is reasonable to look for a perfect analogy or mirror symmetry between physical laws and the non-physical laws of political psychology. So, here's the problem. You can't update the Constitution to reflect the advances in physics since Isaac Newton until you reconcile the two languages of physics that developed after him, specifically general relativity, which Einstein developed in 1915, and quantum mechanics, which was developed in 1927. They're mathematically incommensurable. You can't use the one equation in the domain of the other. You cannot use general relativity to describe things inside of an atom, and you can't use quantum mechanics to describe things that are enormously heavy. Both of those languages of physics were forced to work together to describe a black hole, because the gravitational singularity is simultaneously the smallest thing imaginable and the heaviest thing imaginable. It's infinitely dense. It contains the entire universe, all of space-time, and yet it's the smallest thing possible. It has zero extension in space. And that does fall in line with Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's idea that the collective unconscious archetype of the self, or the Unus Mundus, its function is to unite opposites through mandala imagery. The black hole is a perfect mandala, a perfect two-dimensional sphere encompassing a perfect mathematical point in the center. And lo and behold, within nature's perfect mandala, we find the union of general relativity and quantum mechanics, which is the holy grail of physicists to seek for this unification of the laws of physics. I'm saying it has arrived. The problem with many physicists is that string theory lacks empirical confirmation. The strings are too thin to be observed. We don't have the physical instruments that can observe them. And the compactified dimensions of space around which these strings are wound are also too small to perceive. I'm saying that is compensated somewhat by near-death experience accounts like Carl Jung's. He said that he had a near-death experience in 1944. He broke his foot. He had a heart attack. His consciousness popped out of his body. At 1,000 miles above the earth, he perceived what it seemed to him to be our situation, is that each of us is contained, imprisoned in a little three-dimensional box of illusion here in the material world, which is tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, and that the past, the present, and the future are blissfully interwoven at the horizon where the psyche goes after it dies. It's very similar to the myth of at the end of Plato's Republic, and it perfectly mirrors Leonard Suskind's cosmology of holographic information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos, as I discussed in the previous videos and the entire series of videos I put out about the book, Psyche Singularity. So, now we have the physics that are united, and we can update the Constitution appropriately. But let me now read from President Woodrow Wilson. He put out a book in 1908, Constitutional Government in the United States, and he argues that the Founding Fathers absorbed Newtonianism from the French political philosopher Montesquieu. So here is from President Woodrow Wilson. He says, the government of the United States was constructed upon the Whig theory of political dynamics, which was a sort of unconscious copy of the Newtonian theory of the universe. In our own day, whenever we discuss the structure or development of anything, whether in nature or in society, we consciously follow Mr. Darwin, but before Darwin, they followed Newton. The admirable expositions of the Federalist read like thoughtful applications of Montesquieu to the political needs and circumstances of America. They are full of the theory of checks and balances. The president is bounced off Congress, Congress against the president, and each against the courts. Our statesmen of the earlier generation quoted no one so often as Montesquieu, and they quoted him always as a scientific standard in the field of politics. Politics turned into mechanics under his touch. The theory of gravitation is supreme. The trouble with the theory is that government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. Okay, so I'm saying that the universe is itself life, that each of us is one with the central singularity and the holographic horizon of the cosmos, and that the living constitution should reflect the living universe within which it exists, and that if we can harmonize our legal structure with the structure of the cosmos, that archetypal image will resonate in the citizenry, and that the specific function of this mandala image is to unite opposites. That if we discuss our political differences through this equation, psyche equals singularity, which represents this mandala of the cosmos itself, then unconsciously, instinctively, we will have this power to unite opposites. And we can bring our nation to the next level of development, which Carl Jung called individuation. It's when the individual psyche embraces the opposites in its life, the public demands of the outer world and the collective unconscious instinctive demands of the inner world. In the second half of life, Jung said, the psyche needs to withdraw from both of them, realize that it's not its public persona that it has to pretend to be for its role in public society, nor is it the instinctive desires that motivate it to act in the world. It's unique, it's separate from them, and then it needs to re-embrace the outer and the inner world through the understanding that the outer and the inner world alike emerge from the fundamental archetype of the self. That's how an individual individuates, unites opposites on a higher level of wholeness and health. And I'm saying, in agreement with Jung and Plato, that the collective psyche mirrors the developmental pattern of the individual psyche. So the United States collective psyche can individuate itself. We can reunite the left and the right by consciously instituting this acknowledgement of the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, which is encompassed in this equation, psyche equals singularity. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson says all that progressives ask or desire is permission in an era when development, evolution is the scientific word, to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. Okay, so the problem with Wilson's logic there is he's saying Darwinism is the next step after Newtonianism, which is this mechanistic cosmology. 3 empty dimensions of space, little ball bearings, they interact like a machine according to the laws of gravity. But Darwin based his theory on Newton's physics. It's 3 empty dimensions of space, little ball bearings interact through the eons, randomly combining until self-replicating life forms emerge. So Darwin, being based on that Newtonian cosmology, is undermined by each step in the 20th century that physics took on, because, according to relativity theory, the past, the present, and the future coexist. You can't have a Darwinian timeline if each point on that timeline coexists. It appears from our perspective, embodied in the bodies that we are, that there's this gradual progress of time from the past to the future. But mathematical physics, against our sensory experience, indicates that that's not the case. The future is just as real as the past and the present. They coexist in a 4-dimensional space-time continuum. That's relativity theory. And then quantum mechanics says, and the little ball bearings that randomly combine into self-replicating life, they only exist when they're being observed. When they're not being observed, they merge into waves of probability. So each step forward in 20th century physics, and then string theory says, the past, the present, and the future coexist and are interwoven at each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, and that these fundamental threads of energy radiate inward to create the cinematic hologram that we experience as nature evolving through space-time. How does the Constitution get updated to reflect the realization that the past, the present, and the future coexist? I'm saying the amendments I'm recommending would do that, and that the Darwinian theory is just as endangered. Its to apply it as this all-encompassing theory, Newtonian physics is very useful within a narrow band of things that are not too big and not too small, not moving too fast, and they're not too heavy, or they're not too light. That's what we generally deal with in our day-to-day life. Newtonian physics is very good for predicting what will happen in the usual realm of things that we experience. But when you get very large or very small, then you cannot use Newtonian physics anymore. You need these other two languages of physics, which have been synthesized in string theory. Okay, so I'm saying what makes this most current scientific analogy special, this equating the self with the cosmos, and not likely to be outmoded as quickly as the Newtonian, Darwinian, Freudian paradigm, is that it gets down to the eternal first principle of both the material and mental worlds, which is encapsulated in the equation Psyche equals singularity. So this re-emerging holographic string theory, even though Susskind presented it in an atheistic worldview, it's very similar to the Platonic cosmology and the Vedanta cosmology of India. This is the founding pillars of Western and Eastern philosophy. We've come full circle back to this ancient cosmology within which natural right theory was established. All right, so I'm reading here. This is what Carl Jung said. He believed the same mandala model of the cosmos described in the Vedic and Platonic dialogues arises throughout history without any need for interaction between cultures because each human is implanted with it. All right, returning to Wilson's original essay, he says, there can be no successful government without leadership or without the intimate, almost instinctive coordination of the organs of life and action. This is not theory but fact and displays its force as fact, whatever theories may be thrown across its track. Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Okay, so I'm saying, all right, he's saying this checks and balances that will hamper a living nation from responding quickly in this modern age of instantaneous mass communication and powerful corporate interests. I think he's got a good point there. This is what I believe the fourth branch of government can help us do. Help the other three branches of government come to a consensus much more quickly based on this equation, this common understanding of the self, Psyche equals singularity, which includes its horizon, this mandala definition of the self. According to Jung and Pauli, once we perceive things through this mandala lens, it automatically functions to unite opposites. And that this is what we need, that our conscious rational minds alone are not capable of uniting the left and the right, that we need to depend on this collective unconscious archetype, the specific function of which is to unite opposites on a higher level of evolution. Okay, so let me continue here. In line with Wilson's hopes, though in contrast to his Darwinian assumptions, the ultimate archetype of the self instigates the ultimate instinct to become whole by uniting opposites, therefore to attain what Wilson hoped for, the instinctive concurrence of a three-branched government controlled by two warring factions. We must balance and check the system of checks and balances itself with a fourth branch dedicated to educating the other three branches about the ultimate archetype of unity in us all. The structure of the Constitution must resonate with that archetype of archetypes in order to activate the instinct for union between the two opposing parties that control the three branches of government. All right. So I'm going to now very briefly go over the evolution of physics since Isaac Newton, which has led to string theory, and how when we combine string theory with Jungian psychology, we have this mandala image of the self. So it will make a little more sense if I just very briefly review what has happened since 1687 with Isaac Newton's physics as established in the Principias. So, in 1862, Léon Foucault, a Frenchman, he measured the speed of light, and his experiment was interesting. He had a source of light, and he had a spinning mirror, and then another mirror, and he could detect, when the light was bouncing back and forth. How much had this spinning mirror turned? At any rate, the amazing thing is that he measured the speed of light at 299,796 kilometers per second, which is just 4 kilometers per second faster than the current measurement. So that's about 186 miles per second, or 7.5 laps around the Earth per second. That's the speed of light. Then in the mid-1860s, using those measurements, Foucault's measurements, James Clerk Maxwell discovered that electricity and magnetism form one force, the electromagnetic force, and that it travels at that speed of light that Foucault discovered. But the strange things about Maxwell's equation is that it implies that light will always be measured to be traveling at exactly that same speed, no matter how fast or slow the source of light is moving, or how fast or slow the observer is moving. So if you're driving in a car down the road at 50 miles per hour and another car comes speeding past you and they're going 80 miles per hour, from your perspective, they're only going 30 miles per hour. But that doesn't work like that with light. If you're traveling through the universe at half the speed of light, and then somebody from your stationary point of origin shoots a light beam and it passes you, you're not going to experience it passing you at half the speed of light. You're going to experience it passing you at the speed of light. No matter how fast or slow you're moving or the source of that light is moving, it will always be measured at exactly the same speed of light. It's very, very strange. So Einstein, looking at James Clerk Maxwell's observations, he realized, well, if speed equals the distance traveled divided by the time spent traveling, miles per hour, and if the speed of light must always be constant, then the distance traveled and the time spent traveling must be malleable. Space and time must bend in order to keep that speed of light constant. And the way he resolved this problem was with special relativity in 1905 is that when you move forward, your physical extension is compressed in the direction of travel. So if a light beam went past you and you had a system of rulers to go measure how far it had gone, the rulers are getting compacted in the direction of travel, and your clock will slow down the faster you go in just the right proportion that no matter how fast or slow you're moving, you will always measure a light beam to be moving at exactly the same speed. So this led to what's known as the relativity of simultaneity. And the thought experiment that demonstrates this is if you're at a train platform and a train is coming in and moving on past the platform, and lightning strikes the front and the back of the train simultaneously, you would see the light hit your eyes simultaneously. But people on the train speeding forward would see the light hit the front of the train first, and then the light that hit the rear would have to take some time to travel to them. So from their perspective, the lightning strike hit the front first, and then it hit the back. From the perspective on the platform, they hit simultaneously. So the implication is that I'm going to read this is from Brian Greene, a famous string theorist from Columbia University. He said, once we know that your now can be what I consider the past, or your now can be what I consider the future, and your now is every bit as valid as my now, then we learn that the past must be real, the future must be real. They could be your now. With this bold insight, Einstein shattered one of the most basic concepts of how we experience time. Here's a quote from Einstein. The distinction between past, present, and future, he once said, is only an illusion, however persistent. Okay, so if the distinction between past, present, and future is an illusion, then the standard theory of Darwinism is an illusion. There's no Darwinian timeline groping towards some undisclosed, undiscovered, unexperienced future. The future's fixed. The past is fixed just as much as the present. And every point on the Darwinian timeline coexists. So, okay, how do you account for that understanding? Where does that place the human psyche? If we're not a randomly emerging byproduct of material evolution along this Darwinian timeline, then what are we? Well, according to Carl Jung's near-death experience, we are one with the horizon of the cosmos, where we experience the past, the present, and the future of the entire universe simultaneously and blissfully. And that near-death experience is very similar to many other people's near-death experiences throughout history, again, most famously in the myth of Earth, the end of Plato's Republic. All right, so I'm going to scroll down here a little bit more. In January 1916, all right, so after special relativity, then the problem was, all right, nothing can travel faster than light. However, according to Isaac Newton's theory of gravity, the force of gravity travels infinitely fast because there's an instantaneous gravitational connection between objects, according to his theory. According to Newton's theory, if the sun suddenly disappeared, all of the planets would instantaneously careen out of their orbits. According to Einstein's theory of gravity, which he developed in 1915, the purpose of it was to render the force of gravity, to make it obey the speed limit of light. The force of gravity must travel no faster than the speed of light, the electromagnetic force. And he said, this is what happens. It's not some invisible, infinitely quick force connecting objects. Rather, massive objects exist in a four-dimensional space-time continuum, and they create an indentation in the three-dimensional surface of this four-dimensional fabric. And the way we can visualize it is if we reduce things by one dimension and imagine a trampoline, a two-dimensional surface, an elastic surface. You put a bowling ball in the middle of the trampoline, it creates this deep indentation. And then if you roll billiard balls across the surface of the trampoline, they'll automatically follow this circular curve around that indentation where the bowling ball is. So gravity isn't so much a force as it is bending the elastic fabric of space-time. It's a wave in this elastic fabric of space-time. These gravitational waves were discovered in 2015, 100 years after Einstein established his theory of gravity. You know, if the sun disappeared suddenly, then that indentation in the fabric of space-time would bounce back and it would send a wave rippling throughout the cosmos. It would take about 8 minutes to reach us on Earth, and in those 8 minutes we would continue to orbit around the point where the sun used to be. It would take that gravitational wave the same amount of time as it would take the last photon from the sun to reach us. All right, so that's Einstein's theory of gravity. But then, and then in 1916, Carl Schwarzschild, who provided Einstein his theory of gravity with its first complete description mathematically, he then came out in February of 1916 with another paper that implies the existence of black holes. That if you condense enough mass into a small enough space, it will create an infinitely dense point which will surround itself with what's now called an event horizon, a spherical border where the inward tidal flow of space-time reaches the speed of light. Einstein did not like that. He rejected the idea of black holes, but they have subsequently been proven to exist. And it's these black holes that are throwing this idea of the separation between mind and matter into confusion, because a singularity is not a physical thing. A black hole itself is not a physical thing. They exist, but they're not physical. Well, if something exists and it's not physical in the standard definition of the term, might it then be psychic? I'm saying yes, it is. That each of us is a gravitational singularity. That's this omnicentric singularity. We have separate egos with our separate experiences in three-dimensional space and linear time, but at a fundamental level, we are simultaneously one with each other. And it's that recognition of this fundamental, scientifically understandable unity that if we acknowledge it consciously, it will instigate this instinct of unity through the union of opposites. We've got very good scientific reasons to believe it, and I'm saying the reasons are so strong that it warrants a constitutional amendment. Okay, after general relativity, then in 1927, quantum mechanics was born. But first, at that same year, the Jesuit priest Georges Lemaitre, using Einstein's theory of gravity, which implies that space-time is expanding, he reasoned, well, if it's expanding now, then in the past it must have been contracted into a single point, the primeval atom. That's the Big Bang theory. And then later in 1952, was it? Pope Pius XII put out a papal encyclical basically saying that this Big Bang theory brings us back to the point when God created the universe. The fiat lux, let there be light. So that, even the Catholic Church recognizes that this idea of the Big Bang and the gravitational singularity is very similar to the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient creator. And it is that idea of a creator of the universe and of the laws of nature upon which the idea of natural rights is founded. So, I will now, this is about quantum mechanics. Okay, so 1927, what they wanted to resolve was the fact that sometimes quantum particles act like particles and sometimes they act like waves. So which is it? Are they particles or are they waves? They developed the Two-Slit Experiment in 1927. They shot particles through these two slits at a detector screen behind the two slits. If they're little bullets, these particles should line up directly behind the two slits like bullets. If they're waves, they should hit the two slits and then create two new little waves radiating out, and those two new waves, as they spread out, will interfere with each other and create a ripple pattern. But when they did this experiment, they noticed that when they weren't observing which slit the photons or the electrons, whatever quantum particles they're shooting through these two slits were going through, then although the detector screen detected each particle as an individual hit, they did not align directly behind the two slits. Sometimes they would be found far to the right, far to the left, a little bit up, a little bit down, all around, and then after a certain amount of time, those individual particle hits manifested the same ripple interference pattern that a wave would have created if it had gone through all at once. So then they got an electron microscope. They observed which slit the electrons were going through, and when they did that, suddenly they behaved like well-behaved little particles, and they lined up directly in two slits, just like little bullets would have done. So that was the birth of the realization of the particle wave paradox of quantum mechanics. When you observe these little particles, they act like little waves. And they act like little particles. When they're being measured, they act like particles. When they're not being measured, they act like waves. Waves of what? Waves of probability for where a particle might appear were it to be observed or measured, most likely at the peak or at the valley. So there is another big monkey wrench in the idea of a mechanistic universe with these little soulless ball bearings of matter that exist, whether they're being observed or not. It's been disproven. So if our Constitution is currently modeled on this physics that we've outgrown, maybe it's time to update it. And I'm saying the way we should update it falls right in line with what Carl Jung expected, that when any individual or social group is pulled between opposing demands, these mandala images emerge to point out the way towards this union of opposite. That's what is happening now, I'm saying. Here's a quote from Erwin Schrödinger, one of the discoverers of this particle wave paradox. He compares that particle wave paradox to the philosophy of the Upanishads. So in the book What is Life, that he wrote in 1953, I believe, which helped Watson and Crick discover DNA, he said, from the early great Upanishads, the recognition Atman equals Brahman, the personal self equals the omnipresent, all-comprehending eternal self, was in Indian thought considered far from being blasphemous to represent the quintessence of deepest insight into the happenings of the world. So he thought the particle wave paradox of matter reflected the particle wave paradox of the psyche, where each individual particular personalities, Atman, and at the same time we're all merged in this universal ocean of potential being, Brahman. All right, so then in 1957, Hugh Everett III, an American, I believe he was from Texas, he said, okay, well, what happens in that wave of probability, like a parabola of probability, what happens to all those particles that don't manifest? If you observe it and then it collapses to one point in that wave, most likely at the peak, but it could be anywhere within the wave. What about all those other points? They were equally real in a potential state. His theory was they do manifest in a parallel universe. When you observe a wave of probability and it collapses into a particular point, that causes an innumerable number of other universes to manifest, the only difference between them being the position of that one particle in that one wave of probability. And if you add up these tiny atomic differences, then they expand into enormous differences of a historical timeline. They might be exactly parallel up to a certain point, and then they start to diverge. So every single scenario that you could imagine historically is occurring in one universe or another, according to this multiverse interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is also necessary for string theory. Leonard Susskind agrees with Hugh Everett III that there's this megaverse of parallel universes. And then I say, one philosophical implication of the megaverse theory is the union of free will and determinism. There are an infinite number of fixed futures from which we can freely choose, though every choice we do not make in this universe is made by some parallel version of us. So that's a whole nother tangent we could go on, but these are the kinds of psychological problems that this mandala model of the cosmos and psyche can solve. Free will and determinism. It unites both, the infinite extremes of both. There's an infinite number of choices you can make. It just so happens that all of them are predetermined. All right, so the next milestone, Edwin Hubble, 1929, using the largest telescope of the day in California, he noticed that what was formerly thought of as gas clouds are actually independent galaxies, and that they're all expanding away from ours, and that the farther they are away from us, the faster they're expanding. So the implication is that we really do live in an expanding universe. Just like George Lemaitre had said 2 years earlier, Einstein rejected the theory. After Edwin Hubble, he said, well, then Lemaitre was right, although he still never accepted the idea of a point of infinite density. Yes, some primeval atom, incredibly dense, not infinitely dense, said Einstein. I believe it is infinitely dense, and I believe, therefore, having an infinite amount of space-time in a point of zero volume, that is Carl Jung's definition of a psyche. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. That was that letter, the Leap Day letter that I talked about earlier. So then in the 1930s, they discovered the quantum vacuum in quantum entanglement. The quantum vacuum, when they tried to unite special relativity and quantum mechanics, they came to the discovery that underlying every point of three-dimensional space is this frothing sea of energy made of virtual particle and antiparticle pairs that emerge and then annihilate each other instantly, and they create energy when they do so. How much energy? An infinite amount of energy. The implication is that there is an infinitesimal quantum black hole at every point of three-dimensional space in the quantum vacuum, and that is what is causing the expansion of space-time. And then quantum entanglement in 1935, Einstein, Rosen, and Podolsky, the EPR paradox. Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics, and he investigated the mathematics. He says, strangely enough, it indicates that any two quantum particles that were ever united, then if they separate to opposite ends of the universe later, they must still be united in such a way that if you alter the quantum spin state of one, then the spin state of the other one is instantly altered in the opposite direction. What spin state in the quantum realm means is, I don't think it means spin like a top. I don't think the human mind can visualize it very well, but the point is it implies some infinitely fast form of communication which would violate the speed of light. So Einstein said, therefore, quantum mechanics must be wrong. However, experiments were conducted, and it has been proven that, yes, quantum entanglement is real. If two particles were ever united, then you can separate them as far as you want, spin one way, the other one spins the other way instantaneously. So that's infinite communication and infinite speed of communication, or the apparent separation of the two is an illusion and they're always united. So if some people have pointed out, if all of the particles that ever existed were united in the Big Bang and the singularity, then they remain in instant contact, according to quantum entanglement. This is the kind of the universe that we live in. We have not been able to update our constitution to reflect these advances in physics because general relativity and quantum mechanics were incommensurable. Well, now they're not, according to string theory. All right, so I'm going to continue here. Scrolling down. So yeah, the near-death experiences, I say, are the string theory doesn't have this empirical confirmation, but if we accept near-death experience accounts as true, then people have witnessed these threads of energy from the horizon of the cosmos where the past, present, and future are coexisting. People have experienced that. And if we take their word on it, then we've got empirical confirmation of string theory, which I'm saying warrants this updating of our constitution. All right, so then you had string theory come along. And the problem arose when Stephen Hawking said that once information falls into a black hole, it's erased from the universe. The black hole eventually evaporates, and that information that went in there is gone. So Leonard Susskind and Gerard de Hooft came up with the idea of black hole complementarity and the holographic principle. And that is, if you follow information past the event horizon of a black hole, yes, it's gone. You can't get out. Space-time is receding towards that singularity faster than light once you pass the event horizon, so not even a light signal sending out information could escape. However, if you were watching the black hole from outside and you saw information falling in, from your perspective, it would be smeared out around the horizon, and then it would leak back out with Hawking radiation, which happens when these virtual particle-antiparticle pairs emerge from the vacuum on the razor's edge of the event horizon. The antiparticle gets sucked into the black hole, the particle gets released into the universe, and it carries with it a bit of information conserved on the outer film, the event horizon, and so information is conserved. So that saved the principle of information conservation, which is fundamental to physics. If that had not been conserved, then the entire field of academic physics would have no foundation. That didn't seem to bother Stephen Hawking, but it bothered Susskind and de Hooft tremendously, and I believe they solved the problem. So they said the universe is an inside-out black hole, therefore all of the information describing the past, present, and future of the universe is recorded on the cosmic horizon, and then it radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation on these threads of energy to create this cinematic hologram, this holographic movie. This is what Carl Jung said after his near-death experience. He said, "It seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up in which each person sat by himself in a little box. And I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread." So then he talked about how he was interwoven blissfully with the past, the present, and the future at that outermost horizon. But that each of us is hung up to the horizon of the cosmos in a little box of illusion by a thread, I saw that. I had that in mind on the 4th of July in 2010. I watched Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, and I saw Susskind describe his theory, and it seemed to me to be an exact match. I knew that Jung and Pauli said we should look for a mirror symmetry between psychology and physics, and I saw a perfect mirror symmetry. So that was 10 and a half years ago, and I'm saying the mirror symmetry is so precise, it warrants a constitutional amendment, or two of them, as I'm saying. And then here's something I write. I say, as Locke, Montesquieu, and Newton provided the psychological and cosmological framework of our Constitution, I suggest that we guide the requisite updates by looking to a synthesis of Jung and Susskind. All right, so now here we go to the Federalist Paper number 10, in which Madison explains that the Constitution was constructed to counteract the inevitable formation of factions. Here's the Federalist Paper number 10. I'll read bits and pieces of it. He says, among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. So faction is a self-interested group that puts its needs ahead of the needs of the whole. So there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction, the one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. There are again two methods of removing the causes of faction, the one by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the other by giving to every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. All right, so destroy the liberty to have factions. Don't let people communicate. If they can't communicate with each other, then they can't form factions. The other one is give everyone the same opinions and passions and interests. So he goes on to say, it could never be more truly said than of the first remedy that it was worse than the disease. To cure the disease of faction by destroying the liberty which is essential to its existence, the metaphor he uses would be like trying to save people from a fire in a room by withdrawing all the oxygen from the room to kill the fire. Well, that would also suffocate the people. So you can't destroy the liberty that enables people to form factions. So then we'll give them all the same opinions and passions. Then he says the second expedient is as impracticable as the first would be unwise. He says as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former, his opinions, will be objects to which the latter, his passions, will attach themselves. So people's reason is fallible, and our opinions are attached to our personal selfish desires. So he says, therefore, the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. He says, it is in vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of the whole. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. So how do you control the effects of faction? One is representative form of democracy. The mass-mindedness of the passions of the mass mind are filtered through a representative. It's not a direct democracy. You have a representative. Cast your vote. You vote for your representative, then the representative votes on the laws that get passed. That's one way to control the factions. The other way is the system of checks and balances, so that each of the selfish impulses of one faction will be balanced by the selfish impulses of another. So it's the self-correcting machine. This is the Newtonian design. But what I say is that, all right, the latent causes of faction are sown into human nature, yes, but so are the latent causes of union, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, foremost of which is the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, which I identify with the singularity and its horizon. So Madison points out that as long as human reason remains fallible, factions will form. The implication is that were reason infallible, everyone's opinions would naturally coincide with wisdom, which is the absence of factional passion, or, in other words, the presence of genuine concern for the general good. Then this is what I say. If reason is the ability to trace the many material manifestations of each archetype back to its a priori origin in the collective unconscious, and if the collective unconscious is contained in the universal mandala formed by the central singularity and holographic horizon of the cosmos, then the height of wisdom is realizing how everything and everyone is interwoven into and projected from it. I am suggesting that we need to activate that latent archetype of wholeness by consciously acknowledging it in our constitution. So, how do I do that? 2 amendments. First of all, identify the self with the gravitational singularity. Psyche equals singularity. Secondly, add a 4th branch of government to help the other 3 modulate their public policy decisions through